I'm Tom Gentry, and this is Men Who Talk. It's brought to you by Begin Again Institute, a 2-week intensive program for men with intimacy disorders in Boulder, Colorado, where my friend and co-host Ed Tilton is the Chief Operations Officer. Ed and I wanted to have a series of conversations on some of the barriers we see that prevent men from living more authentic lives. We want to underscore the fact that healthy men do talk. We want to help men who often do struggle with intimacy be more true to themselves. And we want to help people who love men maybe understand them a little bit better. So please listen in, subscribe to the show, share this conversation with someone you love, and enjoy Men Who Talk. So last week, we talked about parenting sons, raising men. And this week, we're going to talk about the intimacy of family. So Ed, do you want to maybe tee this up a little bit here about why you wanted to have Dr. Barnes come?
Yeah. So, Dr. Barnes is somebody who has been just a great resource in the Colorado community and has been just really a great resource for families that are working to recover, from past emotional wounds. And, I don't want to speak for you, Dr. Barnes, but a lot of the work around like really resetting a narrative, to fit the recovery path that you're on. And so we actually were having a conversation the other day, and he was referencing, wanting to get more into Clubhouse, wanting to learn a little bit more about, how it can be utilized and really how he can, carry his own message. Mm. And I said, well, Tom and I hang out at the same time every week. If you want to hop on, and we're going to talk about the intimacy of families, and you can, share a little bit about your work and research, I think everybody wins. So that's kind of what I was hoping to bring to the table, is just a friendly handoff to Dr. Barnes and just an opportunity to learn together. So,
well, and I don't know, for me, I was thinking about this before we got on. Family and intimacy. In my mind, a family should probably be the model for what healthy intimacy looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yet, it so often is not. There's so often enmeshment and alienation. It's a lot of times not the way it could look. And what I've tried to create, like with my relationship with my son, I've talked about this a lot over the course of this series of discussions, is sort of teach him about how to connect with other people with sort of the baseline or the benchmark of how healthy intimacy should be. Have my relationship with him sort of be that reference point. Like, our relationship's supposed to be this way. And depending on whether this person or that person is more or less trustworthy, sort of determines where they fall in your boundary system, right? And it's an interesting time in my life. I've shared a little bit that I moved recently back to Indiana, where I grew up, and I'm the youngest of 8 kids and have a bunch of siblings close by. So this is something I've kind of been mentally preparing myself for and sort of navigating through in the first few weeks that I've lived here back home, and navigating these relationships and where I want the boundaries to be, who I want to be more or less intimate with. And it's just a I guess it's just a really loaded topic. So I'm excited to have Dr. Barnes here to talk about it. So you have any thoughts, Dr. Barnes?
My first thought is, we so often think about, parents driving the process of family intimacy. Parents can't give kids what they don't have. And really, my area of study has been in understanding traumatized families, families with addiction, mental health issues. And so often when we start looking at not only post-traumatic stress disorder, but, developmental trauma and the secondary trauma that is experienced by family members when someone has been traumatized, it really begins to impact trust and the need for hypervigilance and control. And there are just so many factors that we think about intimacy for the process that it actually is, which is that closeness and cohesion, support, trust. The best definition I've ever really heard of intimacy is someone said deeply knowing oneself, or deeply knowing someone while also feeling deeply known themselves. And that's a process that starts with attachment in the earliest days of our lives. And so, like resilience, we used to think that you couldn't teach people to be resilient, and we now understand that that's absolutely not true. And so the idea of people to be intimate, we also have to begin to look at what have been the roadblocks for kind of developing that from the very beginning. We have a new program in our program, and we were just doing a session. One of we're looking at was family life cycle stages. And people tend to take those so casually, like it's just natural, you go through these. But the interruption that having families with addiction or other kinds of problems that prevent people from learning how to, be appropriately dependent and then autonomous, and then the ability to balance both in intimate relationships in their own lives. So I guess my thoughts are the complexity of it is a lot more than just feeling close to people.
Well, I think you pointed on something really, really key, Dr. Barnes, which is, this idea of trust in families and how that trust can be modeled, and also the definition that goes along with trust. I think a lot of times different families have different definitions of trust. Mm-hmm. They can say, hey, trust in our family is really trust but verify, or trust is earned, or trust is given, or how is trust earned in general? Is it a quid pro quo system? Is it, one of the things that we talk a lot about in our program, and the relationship that trust can kind of be built on, oftentimes is surrounded by these vacancy or violation wounds, which can be really confusing for, when we're talking about little kids. Trust could be, can I trust you to keep the family secrets? And so, one of the things that we're often looking at Begin Again is how, how are we reshaping some of these narratives, and how are we reshaping or reacclimating people to behaviors that were maybe modeled incorrectly to begin with. So it's a long process, but it's so great to hear, that there's programs out there that you're working with that give families a starting place.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there are precursors to trust that we tend not to think about, and the first one is connection to self and others. Just being able to connect, being connected to my emotions, to who I am as a person, is very foundation, the foundation of a trusting relationship. And so if I can't trust myself, I certainly am going to struggle to trust others. And the second one, I think, is people believing they have the right to get their needs met. And then knowing how to do that. And I think to a large degree that trusting relationship ties into those two things. And once we can do those, then trust becomes a much more viable option from a kind of a neurological standpoint. Trust and management of our nervous system. And that's really what our program is about. And not to talk too much about the program, but the idea of, and it's one of my things that I really love about 12-step and other support programs, is that the fellowship really promotes those two primary things, or three primary things: connecting to self, connecting to others, getting needs met, trusting. And I think to a very large degree for people who grew up in homes where those weren't taught, that those are the kinds of programs where the healing can begin to happen. And that's what we're trying to do with our program, not just for the client who has addiction or trauma, but for every member of that person's family as well.
One of the things that comes to mind for me in this conversation is being a person in recovery and working in the addiction field. When we talk about families that experience addiction, there's an expression that's used to describe those families or the atmosphere in the family. And that is one of don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. You hear it all the time. And really what that is saying is don't be intimate. Be disconnected from each other. That's really, sort of the trademark of an addictive family system, right?
I think that's a great analogy to that. And the idea of, you have to be independent in order to be safe, or completely autonomous in order to be safe. And so, which is clearly the opposite of intimate.
Dr. Barnes, you brought something up that I think is, I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit more about it, but you mentioned, family life cycles. And when we're talking about this understanding of trust and as it relates to us, that there's shifts that happen within the family that I'm hoping you can touch on with the life cycles, and how does all that play into one another?
I think the thing that's sort of most important is that with each stage that, the family life cycle contains, there are critical tasks that have to be learned. And as parents come together and they hook up to be into a committed relationship, and, really having to learn how to move beyond friendship into true intimate relationships, and making room in their life for their partner and for partner's family and partner's friends. And then how does that impact careers, etc. But when they start having kids, it's really, particularly early, the earliest stages in my mind, it is teaching a balance between being what I call functionally dependent, like things kids can't do. They need their parents to do for them. And when parents can't do those or choose not to do those, we call those betrayal traumas that child will be dealing with probably for a large part of their lives. But the idea is the early stages is really teaching how to get A, to connect with oneself, and B, to be allowed to have needs, and to be able to ask to get those met by crying or whatever method they use. And the third one is to trust that that big person is actually going to be there to do that. And so in these early stages, it's not just a matter of being cared for, but there are really critical kind of developmental skills and kind of neuro network processes that need to be developed. And then when the child moves into school age, it's kind of hoping that the connection to self and needs and trust are already developed, so that they can begin to look at boundaries, and they can begin to look at, I can do these things at school, and I get my other needs met at home. And then into teenage years where we really not downregulate it, but minimize the trust and begin to really look at autonomy, and then into launching. So there are all of these. It's not just, moving into a different developmental stage, but if we get stuck at a certain place, let's say we grew up in a family with chronic addiction, or if we grew up in a family with just a lot of dysfunction, a lot of trauma, where the needs of the parents take precedent over the needs of the kids, then that child will get stuck somewhere in the school age years and really never learn that autonomy, or they'll become really enmeshed with their parents because my needs don't matter. It's my mom's needs that matter. And so, we really like this because this is where a lot of the resentments emerge in the family work that we do. The idea of, I'm really mad at my brother because the day he became an addict, he took my mom and dad away from me. Or I never got to move appropriately to be launched because everyone was so terrified of what he's been doing and thinking I'm going to do the same things. And so, it's really this almost constant balance of trust, and needs, and autonomy, moving from the earliest attachment stages into, more teen or adolescent stages. And what we don't get in our family, we're always going to get with our peers. And so often, if I'm not getting my needs met from my parents for whatever reason, I'm going to hook up with a group of kids that I relate to. And that's where the culture of addiction often comes into play.
It's so interesting. What comes to mind for me with this is just the interdependence aspect of all this. Because if in the course of my development through childhood, my mother's needs supersede mine, and what that may look like is my mother needs to be needed. So rather than teaching me the appropriate tasks at this level of my development, she continues to do them.
Yeah.
Which is something that I see constantly working with men, especially young men with addiction issues so often. And I experienced it myself in different ways, learned helplessness because someone's parent is afraid that, well, we'll pay this bill because if he's late, then it'll affect his credit, or we'll do this because he can't screw this up and we need to make sure it gets done. When essentially the message that the parent is giving to the child is, you're not capable.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person responds accordingly, acts as if they're not capable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that creates a deficiency in self-esteem. And a lot of times the addiction is the way the person medicates that.
I love the fact that there's oftentimes this stigma that addiction only happens in bad families. And I love the way that you frame this to really kind of bring out a different perspective of like, addiction doesn't happen in bad families. Addiction can happen in good families doing the best that they can, but are managing difficult circumstances, and I think one of the things that we've seen come up time and time again is oftentimes like if there's a member of the family that just requires additional attention, it's a family life cycle piece that, I can say I didn't learn in school. So I know that my parents weren't taught on it. I know that their parents weren't taught on it. But, if you've got somebody in the family that, maybe has a disability, or somebody who, their survival is dependent on more attention, how that void can really create an opportunity for addiction to come in. You can have good parents doing the best that they can. Addiction can still happen.
Well, I think that the biggest advancement in addiction and in trauma today is the understanding of epigenetics and how trauma can impact gene function across 3 generations, and where that, how often have we all heard a client say, well, my parents didn't even drink. And when you say, well, which one of your grandparents had a problem? Oh, yeah, my mom's dad had a problem. And so, you have 2 parents maybe that came from families with those histories who worked incredibly hard to provide the healthiest family environment, the most intimate family environment. And yet, they have a genetic predisposition, and if the stress levels are just right, the genes are upregulated or downregulated that set them up addiction. So I think that's a big piece of it. The other is, and a lot of people struggle with it, but if you really read these management literature, it really explains family, how an illness, whether it's cancer, diabetes, or any of the chronic illnesses, and how the family organizes around it. And we talk about that. The family's organized around the problem. But if you can step back from it and look at the impact on the identity of the family and how it alters the rules and roles and organization, it makes perfect sense. And we just, as addiction providers, we say it's a disease, but we don't really treat it like the medical environment treats a chronic disease.
No, I think that I mentioned this in the last episode, but there was a podcast that was done by Radiolab 2 weeks ago called Inheritance. And it's probably one of the best engaging conversations around epigenetics that was explained to me, from a very theatrical kind of way. And it really, it took a look at a situation that was happening up in Scandinavia. There was a community that kept detailed records of not only, families and family and medical illness, but also, seasons and crops. And they were able to show, just from like a health perspective, not even like a mental health perspective, and this was back in like the early 1900s, that they were able to show that when there was starvation in one of the generations, it impacted up to 3 generations later. And when there was abundance in that particular generation, that impacted in a different way up to 3 generations later. And so I think that both these pieces of understanding the epigenetics, and I think, Tom, what you had mentioned, which was being able to talk about family, being able to talk about your family and not subscribing to the don't talk, don't feel, don't acknowledge, is really this piece of like, what is the family legacy? And not just from the perspective of the deficits, but the credits.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to do, maybe this is a good time, is to sort of go back to the main topic of this series of conversations, which is men and intimacy, and where do men fit into this discussion in terms of managing intimacy with family. and what's unique about men and their relationships and in family. Any thoughts on that, Dr. Barnes?
Yeah, I actually kind of, I think if there's intimacy is as much a biopsychosocial issue as addiction or other illnesses, and the idea that we tend to forget that men and women are biologically different in terms of connection, and women release significantly more oxytocin, and they release oxytocin throughout the day, which really facilitates bonding and connection and romantic attachment. And that's why we say women are very tied to emotional intimacy and connection and holding and cuddling and those kinds of things, where men tend to be highly connected to physical intimacy. And when you look at men's release of oxytocin, that men release the highest level of oxytocin that they ever release during the process of sex. And so it influences men from a much more primal kind of physical form of intimacy. And that's the biology part, that women are just far more from a biological standpoint. And I say this as if it's black and white, and it's not. But when we look at the research on intimacy in men and women, a famous author said, among men, sex sometimes results from intimacy. Among women, intimacy sometimes results in sex. And so it really speaks to that physiological difference. Social, Dan Griffin, who's a very noted speaker on men and addiction, talks about the man rules, and don't be weak, and don't show emotion, don't cry, don't ask for help, don't care about relationships, and where that really serves to kind of avoid intimacy, or in order to be a healthy male, all the things that lead to intimacy are generally seen as, and they're socially constructed, obviously, and that they're socially kind of integrated into many families. And what we're really seeing in our program is that there's a real generational divide in that. Men in their, let's say, early 30s, 20s tend to not relate to those man rules, but people older than that, it's kind of that strong, stoic male. I just think there are, some of it's just pure biology, some of it is social construction, but I see that they're kind of in diametrically opposed target areas, if you will.
What about you, Ed? Any thoughts before we open up the stage here? Let some people come up.
Yeah, I'm glad Dr. Barnes brought in Dan Griffin and his work, because I think a lot of what Dan talks about is this idea that, like, acknowledgement and change are part of the initial steps, to having a more intimate community as it relates to authenticity and connection. And I think that our community, we have a phrase that we use in the office a lot of, like, every outcome is perfectly designed, or every outcome is achieved by a perfectly designed process for what we achieved. Meaning, if we didn't get the outcome, it wasn't because the design didn't work. We didn't design it to get the outcome that we wanted. And I think that that's a lot of what excites me about the changes that we're seeing is that men are starting to come forward and say, you know, we would like to be more connected. We would like to, you know, be more engaged in family and have better friendships and experience life fuller. And I mean, that was ultimately kind of the goal of this 8-episode series, is just to start that conversation, to build the community so that my children and Tom, your children, and Dr. Barnes, you know, your children, they have a more authentic connection than what we received.
Well, and this kind of brings me back to the bell hooks work that we talked about early on in this series, where she talks about how deep down men are dying to feel the connection. Mm-hmm. And because they struggle with the intimacy, because of the social constructs and all that, you know, they're not in touch with that deep, deep longing. And I think the real difference we're talking about generationally is that the younger generations are more in touch with that and are more willing to acknowledge it and aren't afraid to own it, you know, that I want to be connected. All men feel that way, right? It's just whether or not they're willing to acknowledge it or express it, or they pretend it doesn't exist because that's what they think they're supposed to do in order to be a man, right?
You know, I think one of the big changes when you think about research from the 60s and the beginning to look at kids' self-esteem and building a healthy identity, you know, there's studies on family functioning, family systems, the idea that, you know, even the parent-child relationship has really shifted from being more authoritative to being more collaborative. And we tend to focus on kids' emotional well-being and self-identity, individuality. And I was reading an article recently that talked about the idea that that's really the new parenting. And so rather than telling kids what to do, it's connecting with kids, developing a level of intimacy. And it doesn't matter if it's a boy or a girl, that there's a mutual benefit on the part of the parents of having kids connected to them as much as it is for the parents to be connected to the kids. So I think it's really been a pretty systemic change since about the mid-60s.
That's great. So we got one more week of this, Ed, right? This is 7.
Mm-hmm. This is 7.
How are we going to put a bow on this?
You know, if I had to say for week 8, I think it'd probably be, it's one thing to say, hey, Ed and Tom and, you know, Dr. Barnes, like, they're doing really cool stuff in Clubhouse, but, you know, how do you take the message outside of Clubhouse?
Yeah.
What do you think, Tom?
I think that's a good point. I think, what can we do to affect change?
What do you think, Dr. Barnes?
Well, I think that the programs that we're developing and trying to share with as many other programs as possible is like a really good way to do that. And I think, you know, the more people you can get talking about these kinds of changes, whether just professionally, and it begins to kind of make its way down into clients, social media of, writing. And it's interesting how many people will say that they never really thought of it the way we're posing it. And I think, that's, our effort is really to give as much of that education away and presentations. And it's really one of the interests that I had with this format was, could we do some of the same things that we're doing in our program in terms of educating on a free format like this? That's really my interest in Clubhouse.
Yeah, I mean, I think and I referenced it a little bit ago. I mean, I wish that, I took a lot of classes in school. I took a lot of classes in high school, and to date, I've never used the Pythagorean theorem. I've completely forgotten what cosine is used for. I mean, I've spoke a little bit of Spanish, but the one thing that I consistently wish that I would have been given freely is just a course on emotion, connection, on how to create a life of authenticity. And so I think, I mean, I'm really excited to kind of have you on, this team, this group, this tribe of men that are really working to get more messaging out there of like, we can do better. We have the knowledge to do better, and better by a mark of connection, not in terms of product. So thank you so much for being on here.
Oh, my pleasure. I was thinking, there's actually a lot of good things happening in terms of schools doing character education, where they take a character trait each week, and that becomes intertwined through the academic work, and schools starting with mindfulness. The problem is, the most influential people in those children's lives are their families. And if it doesn't start there, or at least carry over into there, I think, it's going to be less powerful or less influential. And so I think on some level, we have to get the adults in the room to also recognize, I grew up I'm very open about it. I grew up in a family with addiction and trauma, and but boy, a lot of the families I work with are not very open to talking about that.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that you're making such a valid point. Like mentors that are transitional, be it a football coach or a teacher, I think that they have an impact, but they don't necessarily have the legs to go the distance in a lot of what you were talking about with like the family life cycle pieces. Eventually I'll age out of football, or eventually hopefully I'll move on past the third grade, and then what? So, getting families in the conversation to create a structure for lasting impact is, it's a noble goal to say the least.
Yeah, I think you have to be creative, and that's like one of the things that we're trying to do with our family program is spend a lot of time with siblings, and having the siblings really weighing in on the issues that often, like let's just say the client's a 21-year-old, and the parents are coming, and sometimes siblings come and sometimes not. But I really want the siblings there because they bring a perspective that without them, it gets completely lost. And so the more we can include siblings, brothers, sisters, extended family into the mix, I think the more powerful. And I was preparing a presentation the other day, and I talked about as long as we focus on this objective view of like people's symptoms, we miss the subjective view of that kind of relational, recursive interaction between the symptoms and all of the family members. That we expect to get an objective diagnosis, when in reality, everyone's going to tell a very different story, and certain parts of the story will be far more important to different people. And the reason that I bring that up is to say, if we just focus on the kids and we just focus on the parents, we miss a whole other group that's going to go out and have kids and have relationships that are going to be part of it. So doing some whole family work is pretty critical.
Oh, yeah. No, I got, this was a couple of months back. I was trained in the Arise model with,
Sure.
Dr. Judith Landau. And that was one of the key things that she kept going back to over and over again is when you're working with families, there isn't like a cutoff of what resources a person can, who should be invited in or allowed to kind of give their input, because consistently, you'd have somebody raise their hand and go, well, what if it's like a great grandmother and we're talking about addiction? And, Dr. Landau was like, bring them in. Like, they got stuff to say. And, I remember, I was well into my 30s before anybody in my family ever mentioned that my grandmother struggled with alcoholism. And it was, and the only reason that came out was by accident. We were all telling stories about grandma, and, somebody let it slip that like grandma really liked to go down to the special bottle in the basement. And I went, what? And everybody was like, oh, and they all reinforced it with like, well, you knew. And I, had to let them know, like, no, I had no idea, that this was just something that even if it's not verbally stated, there was a nonverbal pact in all the families or in all the members of the family. Like, we're not going to talk about this. I just thought grandma was like going down to the basement to sneak some ice cream or something. And so again, when you're talking, and this is the beauty of you talking about the epigenetics piece as well, is when you're talking about people's whole life stories, the good, the bad, the transitional, and the environmental, it really allows, I think, the family to kind of bring in a full picture of what they want to, incorporate and to their own coat of arms, so to speak. Like, what does our family represent?
Yeah, and that brings up the whole other area of sort of family health and kind of disability schemas, and how normality is the number one factor. Is we have to look normal. We have to look like every other family. And, we have our clients do a 3-generation assessment and then do a genogram. And it's interesting how resistant they are to contact like grandparents, because they know what the rules are. And if they would just open the door and break those rules, who knows what they could learn about themselves. But it's always one of the most surprising things is they know they don't know much, but they don't want to ask because it's going to rock the boat. Just like in your family with your grandmother. My mother used to say her father was not an alcoholic. He was allergic to alcohol. And
Right.
that made some kind of big distinction. But
yeah,
that was her reality, and it allowed her to feel better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it looks like, one of the things that Ramon says he can't speak right now, but, he's been sober for almost 4 years and can only say that I mostly lost my whole family. And I think that fits in with what you're saying of like, if we don't fit in to the narrative, to the agreements, to the secrets, then we're alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to bring it back to a lot of the pieces that, Tom and I have talked about, as men, if we don't have a role of being if we're alone, who do we protect? And if we don't have a purpose of being a protector, how often is our masculinity questioned? If nobody else will accept me, then I have to ask the question of what's wrong with me.
For me, one of the stories that came up, and I never even thought about, did any of this exist in my family? That I didn't, any of the addiction sort of stuff. And I remember being in treatment and asking my mom about, is there anybody else? Like, were there any mental health thing? Well, there was that one time my dad had to go to the sanitarium because, he was on nerve pills. And I'm like, you mean he had to be detoxed?
Yeah.
From barbiturates. And I mean, it was just framed in a way that, it wasn't, it wasn't addiction, People don't want to upset the apple cart. They especially don't want to upset grandma and grandpa because the shame that comes along with that is like pretty heavy, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, it was the pep talk before like every family engagement in my family. Like I remember mom and dad leaning over the seat and being like, look, we're going to be, and no matter what it was, whether it's like, we're going to be on our best behavior, the rules were kind of gone over before we engaged grandma and grandpa.
It sounds really familiar, Ed. That was exactly the message we got too.
Yeah. It's like, look, my sister and I could have been fighting like cats and dogs. And then as soon as dad like looked over that seat and was like, look, don't embarrass us. It was like, got it.
Yeah. There's that pride too, that makes for such inhibition. Don't be this way, because if you're this way, then we'll feel like we're not living up to the expectation of our parents, which, will bring shame to us. I mean, the whole don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. I mean, it's all there, right? It's so interesting. Yeah. Well, fellas, this has been great. And, I'm looking forward to next week. Dr. Barnes, maybe you can come back. I'd love to have you come back.
Yeah.
And,
great.
I guess we'll give, the folks in the audience one more shot to come up and comment if they want to. And if we don't have any takers, we'll shut this thing down.
I'd like to say one thing to Ramon, and he in a very short little note, he said some really powerful things. And when he said he lost his whole family, and that he had to, I'm just looking at his note real quick, the idea of that he lost his whole family, and it feels working hard to find his true self. My only family once the old me. And I found that one of three things happens when people get sober. And this is, again, a pretty big generalization. But, families say to me all the time, if he would just get sober, we could go back to normal. As if the problem is completely the client. And the research tells us the complete opposite. And the research on chronic disease says if the whole family begins to recognize, boy, we're all a part of this, that we all need to get better, then a person with a chronic disease has the maximum chance of actually living successfully in managing it. But what happens, and Ramon fits one of these characterizations, and one is if the family gets healthy, the client can be the person that he needs to be in recovery and not have to fit into old patterns. And the likelihood of that person getting sober is so much higher. The second one is that the family decides that the client is the problem and that the client either has to fit in. It's kind of living in two worlds. To be in recovery, I have to be this person. To be with my family, I have to be this person. And I would love to hear, Ed and Tom, you've been working in the field as long as I have, or close to it, in the idea of those people almost always relapse, or to a very large degree, you can't live in two worlds. And the third group is the one that Ramon reminds me of, is that idea of, I want to be sober. I don't want to live in two worlds. I don't want to risk that. So I'm going to get all of my social support from people outside in my program, in my home group, things like that. And that we tend not to think about it, that there are really big consequences in families not getting on board.
Well, and, just from my own personal experience in recovery, I can say, I mentioned at the top of the show that I just moved back to Indiana, where I grew up, after being sober for 25 years. And I had a really clear understanding when it came time for me to stop drinking that it probably wasn't going to happen if I stayed near my family, or it was going to be extraordinarily difficult to maintain abstinence and sort of exist in the same pressure cooker I always had. So I went away to treatment and I never came back. I mean, I came back to visit. I waited about a year. There were certain family members who were allies. My mom went to Al-Anon. I had one sister who was in recovery. But other than that, they just kind of didn't get it. So I prioritized my recovery over everything. And I did feel disconnected, isolated, but I was so focused on being a man in recovery and creating that kind of life for myself and breaking the cycle, that nothing was going to deter me from that. And one of the things, like professionally, that I often tell families is I work with a lot of families who are trying to help their loved ones be sober. And a lot of times it's really critical that the families do something different than what they have always done if they expect anything to be different. And what I will say to them is if you don't change, you can absolutely expect them not to change. But if you do something different, if you say you're not coming home, or our relationship with you is going to be much, much different if you're not clean and sober. If you change, they may not change in the short term, but they will be compelled to change in the longer term. Like they will be forced to adapt because you've adapted. And that I have watched gradually happen with my family. There have been no sudden burning bush sort of moments where my family's all of a sudden so much better. But, it started with little things like my mom and dad made it clear at their 50th wedding anniversary. There was going to be a big party, but there wasn't going to be any drinking, which was a huge, huge change of course. So I guess that was a pretty dramatic one. But, you know, after that, it just started to be less prevalent. And then the people who did drink to extreme felt more alienated and didn't come around. And, you know, the next thing you know, 20 years later, I have a bunch of sober family members. And I just spent Easter with all my siblings. And, you know, there were a couple of them who had a few beers, but that was it. It wasn't a mess. And there wasn't the kind of tension that existed when I first got sober. There wasn't, you know, it's much, much healthier. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying to Ramon, I know how hard it was heartbreaking to me for many years to be away from my family. But families, when you look back 10 years from now, you'll see healing will have taken place. It does get better over time, whether it looks like it in the short term or not. And I'm proud of you for doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. And you're not the only one who feels that way. So thanks for sharing. All right, fellas, what do you think?
Well, thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Be a man. Dress for success. Wear the pants in the relationship. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Give the shirt off your back, but don't lose your shirt. Are you really going to wear that shirt? Be a man. Be a ladies' man. Be the man at home. Make a man out of that kid. Sometimes you have to manhandle a situation to show them you're the man. Act like a man. Be the man at the gym. Is that all you can lift? Man up. Whoops. Man down. Be a man. Carry on. Carry your weight. Carry your water. Carry the ball across the goal line. Be a man. Take a chance. Take a risk. Take the job. Take the money. Don't take more than you give. Don't take any crap. Be a man. Be the man at your job. Work like a man. Be successful. Hustle. A hardworking man is a happy man. Never send a boy to do a man's job. Be a man. Take it seriously. Take a joke. Never let him see you sweat. Drink like a man. Smoke like a man. Fight like a man. Be a man. Tough it out. Don't cry. Don't complain. Don't worry. And don't trust doctors. Die like a man.